The riots that rocked cities across England recently were the most serious for a generation. They were more widespread even than those in 1981. Lives were lost, property destroyed, and now thousands are being arrested and imprisoned. Tonight, the big debate asks what we have learned from this unprecedented explosion in the heart of our communities. Were the riots the product of a sudden outbreak of sheer criminality, as Prime Minister David Cameron has argued? Or were there deeper social causes such as unemployment, poverty, social exclusion and institutionalised racism of the police, as a variety of other commentators have suggested? And what should we do now? Prison sentences for those arrested after the riots are much harsher than they were for the same offences before the riots. Is this the right response? Is a society which is cutting its welfare services to the bone just storing up more trouble for the future? The Muslim community in Birmingham and the Turkish and Kurdish community in North London were two of many sections of society deeply touched by the riots. Our guests in the studio were centrally involved in the riots and their aftermath. My name is John Rees and I'll be asking them what they think caused the riots and what we should do next. In the first part of the programme, we're going to be looking at the causes of the riots, what happened at the policing, and joining me in the studio to discuss those issues are Brian Paddick, who's the former Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police Service, Sir Iqbal Sacranie, the former General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain, Azad Ali, Chair of the Muslim Safety Forum, and Wayman Bennett from United Against Fascism. Welcome to the studio, all of you. Brian, let's go back to the very first incident which sparked the riots in Tottenham, because it's almost as if that's now being lost in the subsequent debate. There was a killing of Mark Duggan by the police. There seems to have been serious misreporting of that incident, and we aren't yet clear about why the story was so different than the truth that emerged later. What weight do you attach to that episode in terms of the beginnings of the riots?
When I was the police commander in Lambeth in South London, we had a similar incident where somebody with a cigarette lighter in the shape of a gun was shot and killed by the police. A peaceful demonstration actually resulted subsequently in a riot. So it was on the cards that this was going to happen in Tottenham, and the police should have been prepared for it, is the first thing to say. As far as the misreporting is concerned, it looked very bad for a while in that it appeared that the police had come up with a story that didn't fit the facts. It turns out it was the so-called Independent Police Complaints Commission who assumed that because an officer had a bullet lodged in his radio that was on his chest, that he must have come under fire from somebody else. It turns out that that looks like it must have been a ricocheted police bullet that lodged in his radio, and the misinformation actually came from the IPCC and not from the police.
Wayman, I mean, you're based in Tottenham. I mean, it's true that there was the misreporting in the way that that Brian's described it, but also he touched on the question of the peaceful demonstration which followed it. And now the police's reaction really worsened the situation that was already bad, didn't it, in terms of its reaction to that demonstration?
I was on the family's demonstration the day when it happened. They marched to the police station with a letter, which they asked to give in to the police station. They refused that. They asked if they could speak to a senior officer to receive why they'd been refused to put the letter in. They refused that. Then the police put the shutters down, and then one of the family went up to the door, banged on the door and complained, and she was hustled away and unfortunately badly was beaten by the, it's on YouTube, you can see it, where she was beaten by the police. She was 16 years old, she was a woman, and of course the crowd or the group of people couldn't believe their eyes. They waited 4 hours quietly, peacefully, there was no problems until then, and that detonated a response which I think is almost predictable. If you beat up a young woman in front of her family when they're asking for basic justice questions, I think there's only going to be one response to that, and I think that people then, particularly younger people, felt that they weren't being listened to, they weren't being heard, and they made their voice feel. I mean, people here will think these are shocking scenes, but you've got to imagine people knew that Mark Duggan had been shot, and up until that point, by the police, people had said he hadn't, that he'd been involved in a shootout, and the family knew that wasn't true. And more importantly, in Tottenham, people had film of it, had been from the Ferry Estate, had watched the shooting and reported it. The taxi driver was arrested. so that he couldn't give evidence. I know that other people want to come in, but the whole atmosphere in Tottenham at that time was based on somebody's really, they felt it had been a judicial execution. That's what the mood of it was, especially when they weren't getting any answers from the police. But then to be attacked, for any citizen has a right to go to a police station at that time, and there's special community bodies where you can go and say we need immediate answers because people are unhappy, and they were completely ignored. In fact, a little bit further than that, actually, Mark Duggan was painted as a major gangster inside North London, which was news to his family, news to the people that lived there, and it felt like actually it'd been justified. And I think that had been a common sense notion at that time. And I'll end up with, after the death of Somali culture, people felt there had been a pattern that's been established, and they didn't want that to happen.
Asa, do you think that's true? Do you think people saw it as part of a wider pattern, and how culpable do you think the media has been in losing sight of this original incident in the subsequent coverage of the riots?
I think on the first point, there is a sense of great injustice. If you look at the number of deaths that have occurred in police custody, it's over 300. But not a single police officer has ever been convicted of it. So these kind of statistics are problematic. Also, what Wayman mentioned there is very, very important, which is this attitude of the police to disengage from normal engagement with their communities when a crisis happens causes more of the problems. If they had just spoken to the family, listened to the family, engaged with the family, a lot of this wouldn't have happened. So that's very, very important, that this time and again, every report after every incident, I'm sure after the incident in Lambeth, this was said that, there needs to be more proactive engagement, partnership work with the community. And it's always mentioned, but it's always kind of forgotten when the crisis come. In terms of the media reporting, absolutely, I think, it's very irresponsible reporting. I think we have to say that. Without establishing the facts, without knowing what the media did is stoke up a lot of the problems in the first place. Second, it painted a picture around the country. If you look at what commentators were saying, if you look at how politicians were lining up to, really use strong, aggressive words against people who were committing crimes, by all means, but calling for disproportionate punishment of those individuals. Where did they get all of this from? This has all been fed from disproportionate media reporting.
So, well, how do you feel about this original incident and its place in the kind of in the whole sort of causation of the wider events?
I think one needs to look at the background of the area where the incident took place. Yes, it was a tragic event in terms of the shooting of a young black person there. The area itself has a very high unemployment, and I think as much as we have some evidence of the people involved in the rioting, in terms of a very large chunk, I think more than 70% of those involved in this riots were second-time offenders, and they are not just coming in for the second time, but perhaps they had charged and been under reprimanded, and in many ways some for sentenced as well, about 10 or different offences being committed. And that was an opportunity for these sort of elements to come in. But there was a sizable chunk of the community of that who came in, of course, disgusted with the manner in which the whole present economic climate was in existence, with the cuts taking place in this particular area. I think the clubs for the youth, the shutdown of there wasn't an avenue where they could vent this area, and the idea of coming together, discussing openly, and trying to find solutions. This has been lacking. And whenever such situation as occurred, I remember 30 years ago, back in Brixton and Toxis, there was this straight away there was a clear onslaught that there's black community fighting against the establishment, and not looking at the causes that really ignited this. And I think at that time Michael Heisenthal came up with an idea that we need to really look into it. It's not just simply condemning a community and saying it's just recklessness, criminality that has come in, but one needs to look into the reasons why it is taking place. And I think this in particular incident, there wasn't much of a communication internally to trying to calm down, look at the information, the PR side of it coming out. And of course, the media didn't really play its role in a positive way. That ignited it further, and we can see what spread, the consequences of spreading further of activities in other parts of the country.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, actually, the difference between the government reaction to the 1981 riots and the reaction this time. And I'll come back to that because I think it's important. But before we go to that, just let me stick with that original sort of 48 hours. Now, Brian, I mean, you will have a sort of unique insight into this. There's been a lot of criticism of the police at that point for kind of standing off. I mean, first of all, do you think that was the case? And secondly, if you think it was the case, why? I mean, that's something which perhaps only somebody who's served at a senior level in the police could give us an insight into.
The first thing to say is, following the experience in Brixton 10 years previously, the police should have anticipated that this peaceful protest could have deteriorated into violence, and they should have had sufficient numbers of properly trained officers on duty in Tottenham on the Saturday night, and they did not have that. The second thing to say is that established practice for the police in a riot situation is simply to contain the violence and not to arrest the perpetrators. It's very resource intensive. You need at least 2, if not more, officers for every person that you arrest. You will soon run out of police officers, running the risk that the disorder will spread to other parts of the location. But the difference this time was, with 24-hour media, you saw pictures being transmitted by BBC and Sky and other people showing people going into shops, looting property and walking past the police unhindered with the goods that they had stolen. That, coupled with the social media, Facebook and other things, encouraged other people to go and do the same thing. In other words, they thought, well, if these people we are seeing on our television sets can get away with stealing things without the police taking any action against them at all, we can do that as well.
Well, I mean, I'd just like to sort of unpack, because everybody refers to the riots now, and then there's a particular pieces of film that are shown almost seemingly on a tape loop, which concentrate on the rioting and the theft and the other criminal elements. But in actual fact, the riots were quite different things in different areas. You see, that wasn't perhaps this was the characteristic of some of the film that we saw from Croydon, but in Tottenham it wasn't. In the second place, actually, I live right in the middle of the area in Hackney where this happened. Now, in actual fact, only 2 shops were broken into in the entirety of Hackney. A number of other windows were smashed, some cars were put on fire, but the main characteristic was actually a running fight with the police in that area. So there was virtually no looting at all in the Hackney riot. So the riots in different places were different things. That's what I'm suggesting. Do you think or not?
I think the riots sparked